Douglas Orane, one of Jamaica's most successful business leaders, has identified 3 binding constraints that have prevented Jamaica from reaching its true economic potential. Last week, we looked at solutions to the deficiency in Jamaica's human capital development. Now this week, Mr. Orane gives the solutions to the other 2 binding constraints that are perceived to be keeping back Jamaica: political populism and a very high crime rate. Your Wealth is next.
Your Wealth is brought to you by
Advantage General, the name you should know. We're not in the car business, but if you drive, you ought to know our name. We're not in the construction business, but if you own a home, you ought to know about us. We're definitely not in the medical field, but if you've been in an accident, you'll be glad that we're on your team. We are Jamaica's leading motor, home and contents insurer. Advantage General, the name you should know.
This 9-year-old feature, Your Wealth, was designed to be solutions-oriented, and so to close the year, we look at excerpts of a recent speech given in New York by one of Jamaica's best business leaders, Douglas Orane. Mr. Orane not only identified what he described as the binding constraints to Jamaica's social and economic progress, he offered possible solutions. Last week, we looked at Mr. Orane's prescriptions for solving the deficiency in the island's human capital development. This week, we are reproducing his prescriptions for solving the other 2 main binding constraints: Jamaicans' love affair with political populism and the country's high crime rate. Here's Douglas Orane's take on how to solve the counterproductive issue of political populism.
The first is our love affair with populist political policies. As any of you will know from ever having been in love, breaking up a love affair is emotional, heart-wrenching, and requires steely discipline to change one's habits. We as civil society therefore need to have a laser-like focus on creating the environment that will help our politicians to release themselves from seductive short-term populist policies and truly fall in love instead with growth-inducing strategies. There is a long menu of policies that will induce growth, and I will choose just a few to highlight. The first is that we ensure that our leaders in the public sector manage our resources prudently to move to a balanced budget as soon as possible. Secondly, that we recognize and support the considerable progress that has been made to encourage and sustain monetary stability. Thirdly, that we select the growth inducement strategies that will encourage productivity of our people in every phase of our lives. It is very doable to create prosperity in Jamaica, and this has been demonstrated in recent times by many of our enterprising individuals and companies. I'm addressing the other binding constraint. I'm not accustomed to speaking for so long, but I feel really passionate about this subject, so that's why it is the length it is. As a case study, I will share with you our experiences in Grace Kennedy over the last few decades. Grace Kennedy was listed on the Jamaica Stock Exchange in 1986. Its annual sales were then $167 million US, and the equity, which means the value of the company, was $22 million US. Fast forward 25 years to 2011. Our sales were now $677 million, an increase of 305%, and the equity, that is the value of the company, at the end of December 2011 was $339 million, an increase of 1,440%. This track record This track record of creating prosperity has been achieved by firstly having a clear set of values: honesty, integrity, and trust. Secondly, developing a culture of inclusiveness, which is both egalitarian and meritocratic. As an example, Grace Kennedy has offered purchases of our shares to our employees since 1925, 3 years after the company was founded in 1922. Consequently, we all look at Grace Kennedy as our own company to build. We have several hundreds of our employees and pensioners who are shareholders today.
So how would this highly successful business leader go about reducing Jamaica's exceedingly high crime rate?
The first is to stop the flow of money to corrupt entities and individuals through the award of state contracts. We now need to bring a level of probity to this process, to require that persons who receive state contracts and subcontracts are subjected to fit and proper tests. This would be done in much the same way as persons associated with financial institutions are vetted today by the Bank of Jamaica or the Financial Services Commission. In this regard, we need to increase the support for the Office of the Contractor General to give that office more power to prosecute breaches of the contract award guidelines. In fact, the Contractor General himself has made specific recommendations for amendments of the Constitution to establish a national independent anti-corruption state agency. These recommendations need to be reviewed and the decisions taken in our Parliament to have them passed into law. Second critical issue is that of political party financing. We need to insist on the passage of the draft legislation on campaign funding that has been on the table since 2006. This would require our political parties to make clear and transparent the sources of their financial support. I support the call by the private sector organization of Jamaica for both major political parties to turn over their list of contributors to the political ombudsman on an annual basis. The third issue to be addressed is the establishment of a system of integrity testing for persons who offer themselves for political office. This would require greater transparency in the selection process for candidates within each party that would satisfy the electorate of the suitability of these candidates. Also, once elected, the political representative must be held to the requirement to publicly declare their assets as required by law and prompt action taken where there are breaches.
Interesting solutions to some of the issues preventing Jamaica from moving forward, and they come from a highly successful and results-oriented private sector leader. That's the final edition of Your Wealth for 2012. I'm Owen James.
Your Wealth is brought to you by